So today's daf is daf Kuf Tes, and we'll start where we left off at the Mishnah, which is 5 lines down from the top. And this discussion is about what's called Beis Chanyo. So there's a whole historical question that the Gemara is going to go through here. What we do know about Chanyo is that he was the son of Rav Shimon HaTzadik, who was the Kohen Gadol, and Chanyo was chosen by Rav Shimon HaTzadik to succeed him as the Kohen Gadol. But we're going to learn about the reason why Chanyo had to flee the land of Israel, and he ended up in Mitzrayim, and there he set up a Migdash and brought Karbonos. And that became the base Chanyo. And there's going to be a whole machlokes between the Tanoim as to whether or not this Migdash was dedicated to the service of Hashem or chas v'shalom to idol worship. Harei alai ola, the Mishnah says, right? He took it upon himself to bring an ola, yakrivenu b'migdash. Obviously, if all things are equal, he'll bring the carbon in the Beis HaMikdash. In Mekriva Beis Chanyo, lo yotza. Since he accepted upon himself to bring a carbon ola, and a carbon ola has to be brought in the Beis HaMikdash, bringing it in Beis Chanyo, which is outside of, certainly outside of the Mikdash, is not a fulfillment of his mitzvah. However, if he says Harei olai ola shakrivenu bebeis Chanyo, and here there's a very complicated two tzadim in how to understand his neder. It might be that he's not bringing a carbon at all because he realizes that there are no karbanos outside of the Migdash, and it's some sort of a gift that's not a carbon. Otherwise, we're going to have to say that Yatza, when he says Harei ola shakrivenu bebeis Chanyo, he basically akrivenu b'migdash v'im hikriva b'beis Chanyo Yatza. Why does he fulfill his obligation if it's not a valid carbon? And the answer is he has fulfilled his obligation vis-a-vis the value that he dedicated to the Migdash. So we'll see this. I'm just giving you a forecast, a forespeis. Rabbi Shimon Omer ein zu ola. Rabbi Shimon says that since he said in his language akrivenu, and that means he accepted upon himself as a carbon, but then he added bebeis Chanyo, which is impossible. So there's a contradiction here between the first thing he said and the second. Therefore, we throw it all out. And he never accepted upon himself anything. He has no pledge whatsoever. Hareini nazir yigalech b'migdash. When a person accepts upon himself nazirus and completes his nazirus, he has to do a giluach, and that has to take place in the Beis HaMikdash, as we see in Parshas Naso. Just going to shut this off. I think I forgot to do that. Yeah. However, what happens if he says that he wants to be a Nazir and Gilech, and he went ahead and instead of doing the Giluach, which is supposed to terminate his Nazirus, he did it not in the Migdash, but Bebeis Chanyo, Lo Yatza, because again, he accepted upon himself a classic Nazirus. But, says the Mishnah, Hareini Noz Shagalech Bebeis Chanyo, he made a condition in his Nazirus that his Giluach would take place in Beis Chanyo. Once again, we're going to have Machlokes in Tanakama and Reb Shimon whether such a Kabbal's Nazirus is valid. The Tanakama says, Yigalech b'migdash, he has accepted upon himself Nazirus, even though he made a condition that he'll do the Giluach outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but nevertheless, his lechatchila requirement is to do the Giluach in the Beis HaMikdash. But the Tanakama holds him Gilech b'beis Chanyo Yatza, that he has fulfilled his neder when he does Gilu of Beis Chanyo because he said, I'm accepting the Zirus on the condition that I will be Megalech in Beis Chanyo. But if Shimon Omer said, no, so this is not acceptance of Nazirus because Nazirus by definition requires a Giluach in the Beis HaMikdash. If he wants to play around with that and try to reformulate that, that's not a valid Kabbalah's Nazirus. So the Gemara asks the following question. Yotza. In the Mishnah it says that if he takes upon himself Harei Alai Ola Shakrivenu Beis Chanyo, and he brings the Ola in the Beis Chanyo Yotza. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? How could it be Yotze a pledge for a carbon, and how could that carbon possibly be valid? Miktal Ketola, he didn't do a shchita, right? The shchita that is necessary for a carbon would only be a shchitas carbon in the Migdash. He did a shchitas carbon in Beis Chanyo. That's basically like killing an animal, like shooting an arrow through his head. That's not shchita. So how can you possibly tell me that he fulfilled his chiyuv of bringing a carbon? Omrav Hamnuna, Naseka Omer. We reinterpret his words. Harei olal manashalo eschayev b'achrayusa. He's saying that I just want to accept upon myself a neder. I'm not responsible if, let's say, the animal dies, or even if I kill the animal, and therefore I cannot bring this carbon. Nevertheless, I'm not responsible for the carbon. I don't have to replace it. But it comes out that according to Rav Hamnuna, we are understanding that he dedicated a carbon, and he's dedicating the carbon in a way that he'll kill the carbon, he'll kill the animal, and he's not responsible to replace it. Now, Rashi points out over here that if you do an avoda, which he presumably wants to do, outside of the Mikdash, you have kares for that. So it's a very sensitive or paradoxical situation. The Mishnah says yatsa, which means he doesn't have to replace it. But on the other hand, he's chayiv kares because he killed the animal. But he killed it b'tor shchita for the purpose of an avoda chutz l'mikdash. Amalei Rav objects to Rav Hamnuna. He says, Elamayata, let's read the case of the Sefer and see if you, Rav Hamnuna, could apply your same logic in the Sefer. The Ketani, it says in the Sefer, Reini knows shagalech beis chanyu galech v'mikdash v'gilu beis chanyu yotza. What does that mean? Are you telling me that Hachinami Nasik Omar Reini knows al Menachos eschayev biachrayus karbonosov? I don't have a responsibility to replace the karbonos, but Nazir kimod lo maisi karbonos lo miskasher. If he really accepted upon himself a Nazir, a Nazirus, and the Nazirus is chal, then the only way he could terminate the Nazirus is by bringing his karbonos. Without bringing his karbonos, he doesn't terminate his Nazirus. So how can you say yotza? Yotza what? Elamarava. We have to reinterpret the Mishnah. When a person takes upon himself a neder to bring a carbon in the Beis Chanyo, Adam Zelidora Niskaven, he didn't really have in mind a carbon. There's no such thing as a carbon in Beis Chanyo. But rather, Lidoron. Lidoron means, again, it's difficult to understand this Gemara, and it's a Mishnah, basically, according to Rav, that it's a gift. He's like giving a gift to Hashem. It's not really technically a carbon. Omar Isagi v'beis Chanyu tarichna. You know what he's saying? That look, it's a long way to get to Alexandria in Mitzrayim. If I make it, then you know what? I'll give this gift by slaughtering the animal for Hashem as a gift. But tfei, if it's too hard and far for me to go, I can't schlep all the way to Mitzrayim, is then Lo matzinu litztaruye. I can't be responsible for that. It's only a nice thing to bring a gift, but if I can't do it, then the deal is off. Nazir Nami, the same thing now says Rav, we could apply consistently to the Sefer of Nazir. Hi Gavra Litziri Nafshi Kamachavin. He wasn't interested in becoming a Nazir. He accepted upon himself to live out or duplicate the activities and the behavior patterns of a Nazir, but he's not really a Nazir. And therefore he says, but Omar Isagya Beis Chanyo Tarichna, if I could make it to Beis Chanyo and bring my Ki'ilu Karbanos, which again, you can't bring Karbanos, but Tfei Lo Matzinu Litzarui, I can't bother anymore. However, Rav Hamnuna Amalacha, he's going to accept half of what Rava says, but not the whole deal. Nazir Kidika Amrit. The way you, Rava, have interpreted the Sefer by Nazir, I accepted it. He's only l'tziure nafshi kamachavin. He didn't have any intention to have the karbonos of a Nazir, but Ola in the ratio when he accepted upon himself to bring a carbon Ola Menachos eschai bachrusa kamar, that's where I said that his intention is to bring a carbon Ola, but without any responsibility to replace the Ola in event that it gets lost or it dies, so that when he does the shechita in the Beis Chanyo, he's for all intents and purposes, he has killed the animal, but he's not obligated in achrayus. That was the condition he set. V'yaf Rabbi Yochanan savar lahad Rav Hamnuna, and this interpretation of the Reisha in the case of an Ola Almanas Shlo Eschayev was accepted by Rava. How do we know this? By Rabbi Yochanan. How do we know this? The Omar Rabba Bar Bachana Rabbi Yochanan Harei Alai Sha'akri Veno Bebeis Chanyo. Right, I'm going to bring an Ola. Harei Alai Ola, and the condition is that I'll offer the Ola in the Beis Chanyo. Hikriva Bi Eretz Yisrael Yotza the Anush Karis. Which means that he didn't bring it to the Beis HaMikdash. When it says here Be'eretz Yisrael, it's outside of the Mikdash. And therefore, he is chayiv for halas chutz. In other words, he brought a carbon that should have been brought in the Beis HaMikdash because he accepted upon himself to bring an olah. But instead, he was makriv in the Beis Chanyo, and that's outside of the Mikdash, and therefore he's chayiv kares. Now again, what does the word yotza mean? Yotza means that he has no further obligation because he stipulated that he has no achrayus to replace the animal if it's gone. Tanya Nami Hachi, and we brought a brisa to support Rav Hamnuna's Reisha, and that is Harei Olash Akrivenu b'Midbar. So here he took it a neder to bring an ola, but not in the Beis Chanyo, but it'll be makrivid in the desert, and a kriva b'Ever Yarden. And he was makrivit on the eastern side of the Jordan River, which means that he was makrivit outside of the bounds of Eretz Yisrael. Yotza means, again, he doesn't have to replace it, but Anush Kares is Chayiv Kares. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Kuf Tes. A Kohen who tragically does the avoda for the goyim, for the idol worshippers in their temple, is completely disqualified for ever serving as a Kohen in the Beis HaMikdash. But what happens if a Kohen who serves in Beis Chanyo? So this Mishnah is sort of a continuation of the previous Mishnah. We'll get into the history of Beis Chanyo. HaKohanim sheshimshu Beis Chanyo lo yishamshu b'mikdash b'Yishalayim. We don't want them, again, assuming that Beis Chanyo was a place where there was idolatry. We don't want them anymore to be misharis, to serve as Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the question here is, there are a couple of questions to ask here. If the Gemara, if the Mishnah is assuming that Beis Chanyo is a makom avodah zara, then what does it mean? V'ein tzarich lamu l'davracha. The word davracha, the phrase davracha, refers to avodah zara. So obviously, it's something other than avodah zara. And if it's other than avodah zara, why do we say that he became disqualified to serve in the Mikdash? And secondly, if he went ahead b'di'evet and he did serve in the Mikdash, would he have possible to be mechal his avod? Now, on the second question, the Rambam in Hilchas Bias Mikdash seems to imply that b'di'evet, if he went ahead and he did the avoda, then the avoda is kshera. If he did the avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. And that sure sheds a light on our first question, namely that the reason we're going to passel him for service in the Beis Hamikdash lechatchila is because we want to penalize him for serving in Beis Chanyo. Because even if Beis Chanyo is a place where they worship God, but nevertheless, that's not a good place for bringing karbonos and for going to serve, to set up the sacrifices. So he shouldn't have done that. So again, he's not in violation of Avodah Zarah, but he is in violation of the law of serving as a Kohen outside the Beis Hamikdash and bringing karbonos, in this case, in Beis Chanyo. And as a result, we're going to penalize him. We're not going to allow him to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. But Me'ikar Adin, without this penalty, he would be, right, without instituting this penalty, he would be a Kohen Ovid. And therefore, b'di'evet, the Rambam says his korban is kosher. Shenemar. Now we're talking about Dover Acher, which means that he brought a korban for the sake of idolatry. And the pasuk says, Ach lo yalu kohenei abamos el mizbach Hashem b'Yerushalayim. These people will not be able to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Now, who are these people? So, if we're going to say that the Rabbanim made a penalty for those who served in the Beis Chanyo, even though it was not avodah zarah, as we said before, but nevertheless, lo yalu l'chatchila, we're not going to allow these kohanim to go up to the mizbeach and do karbanos, do the avodah of the karbanos, and the pasuk says kohenei abamos, and the word bamos here is a reference or an allusion, I would say, to Beis Chanyo, because Beis Chanyo is a bama, but it's an illegal bama, because once the Mikdash stood in Yerushalayim, then bamos, to shecht an animal on a bama, is completely prohibited. It's a violation of a doraisa. And therefore, we don't want to allow him to serve in the Mikdash. Ki im achlu matzos b'toch achem. However, as far as menachos are concerned, the word matzos here is an allusion to menachos, which are all baked as matzah. Harei elu kabali mumin. With regard to menachos, we're going to treat them like a bal mum. Now, what is the status of a bal mum with regard to menachos? Cholkim v'olchlim v'lo makrivim. A bal mum cannot do the avoda, the kmitza, etc., of a mincha. He's puzzled, but he can eat from the korban mincha, meaning after the kohen kosher does the kmitza, this bal mum is allowed to eat from the shirayim like any other kohen, and cholkim. Cholkim means, we said many times that the Beis Av have monetary rights to get whatever they could get, meaning whether it's the hides, whether it's the basar, whatever it might be. In the case of mincha, it's the shiurei mincha, and they still have rights. And now we're equating a kohen who did the avodah in a bama illegally, meaning in Beis Chanyo when the Mikdash stood. Then we're not going to allow him to do hakrava, but he still retains his status like a kohen bal mum, and therefore he will eat from the menachos. Can't do the avodah, but he can eat from the menachos. If he did the avodah again b'di'evet, then the Rambam says it's kosher. Okay, Omar Rav Yehuda. The Gemara now wants to understand what went on in this Beis Chanyo. You know, is it a temple for pagan culture and idolatry or not? What is it? So Rav Yehuda says that kohen sheshochet lavodas kochavim karbano reich nichoach. This is fascinating. When we say that a kohen who served and brought a korban in for the sake of idolatry, he's excluded, what it means is that Just one second. What it means is that if he did the avoda, now we've discussed on various occasions, what's the first stage of the avoda? Is it shchita or is it beyond that? Kabbalah Saddam and Holachas Adam and Zrika. So what Rabbi Yehuda seems to be advocating is that shchita per se is not an avoda. And the proof of the pudding is that it's ksher bizarre. Even a non-Kohen could do the shchita of a korban. And therefore, since this Kohen, although he shechted for the sake of Avodah Zarah, and if all things were equal and he was mazid and Adam Hasro, we put him to death, but nevertheless, he did not do an avoda, which begins with Kabbalah, etc., for the sake of Avodah Zarah, because shchita does not have the status of avoda. And therefore, if this Kohen, who now is guilty of Avodah Zarah because he shechted l'shem Avodah Zarah, would do tshuva, we can now accept him, and his korbanos will be valid. Why? Because he didn't do an avoda for the sake of Avodah Zarah. Omar Rabbi Yisrael Pravdimi, my kra, where do you know this from? And the answer is, and we're quoting now a pasuk where in Yechezkel, Yan asher yisharsu osam l'fnei guleim v'hayil beis Yisrael lemichshal avon akena sasi yode aleim numa shem l'kivinosu avonam. And we're talking about yisharsu. Yisharsu means sherus, which means serving. And we're assuming now, in the light of Rabbi Yehuda's statement, that shchita is not called yisharsu. It's not including yisharsu. Ksiv basrei v'lo yikshu elai l'kayin li. Meaning the Torah, the pasuk in Yechezkel is now saying that such a person who is guilty of l'shares giluleihem referring to is completely excluded. Lo yikshu elai l'kayin, they cannot approach to serve me. And the implication, by the way, is that even, again, if the Kohen did sherus beyond shchita, right? Even if he was a shogeg, which again is hard to imagine, but let's say for some reason he thought that, for the sake of goodwill, he's allowed to do this for an idol, then nevertheless he's completely excluded. He ovid shares in, but shchita lav shares. But shchita, the fact that it's kosher bizarre, proves that it's not a full-fledged avoda. Again, it is an avoda, but it's not an avoda. And you could write a whole PhD thesis on the status of shchita in korbanos. So therefore, if a Kohen did shchita in one of their temples for the sake of avodah zarah, if he does tshuva, then we're allowing him to do the avodah as a Kohen in the Beis Hamikdash because he was not guilty of sherus. Itmar shogag bezrika. Now we get to sherus itself, right? We're past shchita, we're up to zrika. That's the real McCoy sherus, but he was a shogeg. And here, as I said before, we're going to have an issue because it's very possible, if we fast forward to Rav Sheshes for a second, leaving out Rav Nachman, ein korban orech nichoch, even if he does tshuva, but because he did a sherus of zrika for the sake of avodah zarah in their temples, he can never ever do the avodah in the mikdash. It's a psul gavra forever and ever, even though he was a shogeg. And by the way, I can't quote any sources to prove what I'm saying, but I think that if a Kohen would unintentionally kill someone, murder a Jew, unintentionally, he would never be able to duch it. In any event, Rav Nachman Omer, Karbonu Reich Nichoch. Yeah, there's a whole discussion why it says Reich Nichoch and not kosher. But what's interesting to us is that Rav Nachman is saying that even though he did a Sherus Mamish of Zrika in the temple of the pagans for the sake of idolatry, nevertheless he's okay. We can allow him to serve as a Kohen in the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because he was only a shogeg. Amar Rav Sheshes Minan immediately. What's my basis to derive the conclusion that this is so, even though he was a shogeg? Now, the word avon means mazid, but the word michshol seems to indicate shogeg. My love, o mikshal o shogeg. O avon. In other words, the pasuk contradicts itself. On the one hand, it says mikshal, on the other hand, it says avon. Now, other. Which one is it? So the answer is mikshal shogeg, the avon mezid. And the pasuk is telling me that it doesn't matter whether the Kohen did the sheirus, the avoda, the zrika, in the base aku, whether he did it b'mezid or b'shogeg, is the Torah said, the pasuk says he shall not serve in the Beis Hamikdash. But Rav Nachman says michshol de avon. The word avon means mezid, and the word michshol means a michshol of an avon, but it's got to be mezid. And what's the source? Says Rav Nachman, from my opinion, I learned to the Bryce of Chiper HaKohen al Nefesh HaShogeges Bechota Becheta B'Shkaga Melamed shekohen miskaper al yidei atzmo. What does this mean? The Kohen could atone for himself, right? V'chiper Kohen al hanefesh, on himself. B'mai. I lema b'shchita ma'ir yeshogi afilu mezid, right? We came to the conclusion that if the Kohen did a shchita for the sake of avodah zarah, but shchita is not a sheirus, then even if he did it b'mezid, it doesn't matter. He still could do tshuva and he could serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Ela b'zrika. And yet, if he did the zrika b'mezid, he's disqualified for serving in the Beis Hamikdash. But if he did the zrika unintentionally b'shogeg, he's not disqualified. Rav Sheshes Omer L'cha. What's Rav Shesh's response? Li'olam b'shchita. Really, we're talking about shchita. And according to Rav Sheshes, even if he did the shchita and even if he was a shogeg, nevertheless, that shogeg, if he did a sheirus of zrika, would passel him even though he was unintentional and he could never serve in the mikdash. But if it was only a shchita, which is not a sheirus, then it depends on whether he was a mezid or a shogeg. Ubemezid lo nasa misharei slavodas kochov. The Ozlatamayu, Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes follow their, consistent views. The Itmar Hazid b'shchita, so he slaughtered an animal as part of pagan worship. Then he did tshuva. Is Rav Nachman Omar Karbonorech Nichach? He's kosher. He did tshuva. Rav Sheshes Omar, since he was mazid, even though it was only shchita, ein Karbonorech Nichach. Rav Nachman Omar Karbonorech Nichach v'lo ovad sheirus, because he didn't do sheirus, he only did shchita. Rav Sheshes Omar ein Karbonorech Nichach, because nase mishoreis lavodas kochavim.